Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin.
And I'm Justin Clark.
And today we're discussing the future of sound. With us today is Ezra Buchla. Ezra is a digital signal processing engineer. He's someone who has worked deeply in the music space, so creating music hardware and software. And more recently, he's working in the hearing space, so on how people perceive sounds and augmenting their ability to hear those sounds. So Ezra, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I can't think of anyone I know who knows more about sound than you do.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. So before we get into the future scenarios around craziness like sonic weapons and sonic methods of dislodging tumors and all of the possibilities, I'd like to first just define what is sound. And I think a useful way to frame it is, how is sound different than vision or than any of our other senses? What is it that sound allows us to perceive as compared to something like vision? And then maybe what is sound just fundamentally, separate from our perception of it as more of an objective phenomenon?
Well, there's sort of the sort of empirical physical definition of sound that is fairly straightforward, and that it's a pressure wave, usually in the medium of air, but it could be any compressible medium. Mm-hmm. And I think our perception of sound is pretty close to that, but can include. Sometimes we perceive things that seem like sounds, but aren't actually produced by a pressure gradient. Things
Could you give an example?
Yeah, things like tinnitus, where there's actually a lot of signals being produced within your own body that you can hear in a totally silent environment. There's always some sort of noise in the brain going on, and maybe you can even go to a sort of metaphysical definition, and that might be beyond our scope. But
I don't think that's beyond our scope. I certainly have
I
some
want to know it.
Follow-up questions on that. But yeah, I guess as I was thinking about my own perception of sound, it seems very fitting because at least in LA, it's very rainy today. So I was just sitting on my porch and realizing that the difference between vision and sound, with vision, it's really just whatever you're looking at, and the light is refracting off of specific molecules that are within the wavelengths we can perceive. So it's this way for, we can't see air, we can only see a certain group of particles. Whereas with sound, it's not that we're hearing the actual particles, it's that, like you said, it's the force. So we're able to perceive in a 360-degree sense what's going on around us. So if you hear rain or if you hear something crash, you're able to build up a view of reality based on the directional force of all of these molecules and atoms bumping into each other. So it's just really fascinating to think about it from that sense. And I tried to look into if most organisms first developed vision or if most organisms first developed hearing. And it seems like the jury is still out on that one. But it is interesting to me to just think about, like, how does sound increase our ability to survive, and how does it build up our perception of reality itself?
Yeah, no, that's totally interesting, and that's kind of where I thought you might be going with that. But yeah, sound and vision, of course, are interesting evolutionarily. It's funny that we are able to close our eyes, but we can't close our ears, right? It's and that almost seems like just sort of an accident, like his eyeballs need to be moistened in the air to keep functioning. But it's also, if you look at sort of the structure of our eyes and the structure of our ears and the way they evolved, it seems likely that, since we have stereoscopic vision, which is kind of a something that predatory creatures tend to evolve so that they can.
And what is that?
It's like we have two eyes in the front of our heads looking at the same things from a slightly different angle, so we have depth perception.
As opposed to like those like flat fish that just see on one side, or
or even like a it's just funny if you look in the animal kingdom. And by the way, eyes and ears both evolved many times over convergently. I was just reading that eyes probably evolved 40 or 50 times in totally different mechanisms. But especially if you look at mammals, birds,
chameleons,
chordates.
They have like two separate eyes that seem to act totally independent.
Yeah, well, so if we just look at the vertebrates, land animals, more complex animals like us, the sort of herbivores tend to have an eye on each side of their head. And the carnivores tend to have two eyes in the front of their head, because what the deer or the mouse needs to do is to sort of be aware of its surroundings so it can run away, and what the cat or the owl need to do is track their prey accurately, and I think that we have this stereoscopic sort of predator vision that I think reflects on the way we kind of talk about vision and sound. Like we talk about the gaze, like it's an intentional thing that you're sort of shooting at an object that you're interested in.
Like pay attention, you like look straight at someone.
Right. And whereas our auditory system is, I think, feels at least like an older, like a prey, like a sense from our days as prey animals, where it's always on. It's on even in our sleep, and it's sort of there. It's like an alarm system. It's like sounds can very easily and readily tap into our sort of flight or fight response, right? It's and you can be, it can startle you out of sleep into this like state of readiness.
Right. That's interesting. I remember this one study that I read, which was actually a sleep study, but they were trying to understand the sleep patterns of humans as they originally evolved. So removing the modern day city, all of those inputs. And so they studied this one tribe that was basically living the same way we lived when we were hunter-gatherers. And they found that the older people in the tribe, especially the older, grandmothers, almost acted like the alarm system for the tribe. They were very light sleepers. They would sleep less as they got later in life, and it was almost like they're supposed to be sort of the alarm bell. If anything came, they would wake up the rest of the members. So it definitely seems quite plausible that our sound perceptions are sort of a defensive mechanism for us, whereas like you said, our vision is more of a predatory, tracking some sort of animal in a particular way, as opposed to an herbivore, which is more just like also defensively looking in all surroundings, but not really tracking and hunting anything down in the same way that we do.
Yeah, at least it certainly kind of makes an intuitive sense to me to think about it that way, and of course, because as you said, we can hear things all around us, 360 degrees of directionality, and we can hear things very far away in a quiet environment, even things that are occluded to our vision. And
why did some animals, I guess it's you could say evolution is the answer, but why did some animals develop such different capabilities with sound compared to other animals? It's like, why is there, is it just sort of random that some animals had a strategy that was largely a vision strategy, whereas other animals are largely a sound survival strategy, and whereas some animals seem to have really great on both ends, like a hawk who's able to hear but also see very far away?
Probably
Yeah, I
depends on
don't.
their environment too. Like depending on what the predator is. Like if you're in the depths of the ocean, they probably evolved some sort of sensory mechanism that was not related to sight. Instead, they had to sense their surroundings at all time because the evolution is always shaped by the environment in which the animals are in. So, I mean, it could start with some sort of randomness, like you were saying, but as they're in a more stable environment, then over time they evolve to adapt to this environment so that, you know, depending on what the day and night structure is, depending on what the weather patterns are, depending on who their prey or their predators are. So I think there's just so much variation.
Yeah, it's
involved.
interesting also that I think intuitively you would think that sound moves slower through water, but it actually moves faster than it does through air. And it's like the more dense the material is, like it moves way faster than water through steel, for instance.
Sure.
So I wonder if that has any correlations with the capabilities of, let's say, dolphins talking to one another and all of these weird sounds like whales singing in the depths. And we really have no idea what they're saying to one another, or orcas, for instance, which have a whole part of their brain that has emotional intelligence that humans don't have. So I wonder how much communication might be augmented by just the fact that lots of in the water it conduces sound much more quickly, and maybe you can communicate a lot better.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about evolutionary pressures and to speculate about them. But ultimately, we do assume that there's that if an organism has a very sophisticated auditory system, it did evolve for some reason under some sort of evolutionary pressure. But it's also possible to have local maxima in evolution. So basically, like once an organism evolves better ears than it does eyes, maybe its ears just get better and better until it's got the best ears around, and that can give it an advantage in any environment, or in a and it's not going to like go back and lose its ears and evolve eyes instead, or something. But certainly there's a lot of environmental conditions. You see a lot of desert animals have really, really great hearing.
Right, like the desert
I'm not
fox.
sure. I guess because I suppose because of the landscape, right? Because there's not a lot of mountainous terrain that's gonna deflect or obfuscate a sound wave.
It is interesting also just like thinking about how it's a sound wave. I think fundamentally people often think of the world as being very solid, and it's like, oh, you got solid ground, solid buildings, and everything feels very immovable. But there was this one thought experiment that I thought was interesting where imagine you have a steel rod going all the way from the Earth to the moon, and imagine if you pushed that steel rod 10 meters higher from the Earth. It would actually take 18 minutes before the end that's on the side of the moon would move at all, because basically you're just pushing the collection of atoms and molecules that are nearest to you, and then it basically just like that wave sort of, even through steel, pushes, and it takes a lot of time to get all the way to the other end. So if you think of the world in that way, really nothing is solid. Like even something like steel, it's not solid. It's just a connection, a collection of tightly packed atoms. And so sound really allows us to perceive the world in its more gooey, wave-like way, whereas vision seems to be more of like a, particular points, more physical than this like gooey, wave-like world where we seem to be perceiving through sound.
Yeah, that's a cool way to think about it. And I guess, maybe if it was possible, maybe we would have like ear flaps or ear lids in the same way that we have eyelids, except there's no, we don't have, like, our bodies don't have any material, don't produce like a non-compressible material that could actually block sound. So, that'd be very hard to imagine. But one way or another, the auditory system is much more open and always on and always gathering stimuli from the world, sort of for better or for worse, I would say, given the way that our acoustic world is changing.
Right. Another question I wanted to ask you, Ezra, is about just sort of the way that sound helps build our perception of time. And especially, I mean, when I think about this in my personal life, music especially has been a way where I can be listening to something and a whole hour can pass and it feels like 5 minutes. Or if you're at an incredible music festival or concert and you just get totally lost in the music. And the most profound experience I had was when I was I was at a yoga retreat in Bali, and at the end of every class the yogi plays just some acoustic guitar, no lyrics. And it was a really challenging class, and at the end of that class I was in Shavasana and he was playing, and then there was like a long period of silence, and then he like strummed like in a really intense part of the song, and it was like I felt time stop and my soul like pushed out of my chest, and I just like felt like I was expanding for thousands of miles in every direction. And it only lasted for probably like a moment, but afterwards I was just like, whoa. So like, what is it about sound that lets you totally lose yourself in the moment and it warps your sense of internal time? Like, why is it that sound is able to do something like this, whereas our other senses don't seem to be tied into our perception of sound and reality in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fascinating question, and I don't think there's a very easy answer, but there's no doubt that time, time and sound are very closely related. I mean, we talk about frequencies a lot, and a frequency is just the inverse of a duration. So, I mean, vision. So visible light is also periodic and also has a frequency and is also made out of waves, but they're at a much higher rate, where we that is kind of very far from our conscious experience of time. The time that it takes for a blue light wave to sort of switch on and off, or to push and pull our vision is infinitesimal. And sound, on the other hand, works at a much lower range of frequencies, where once there's kind of a continuous there's kind of a continuity between the lowest frequency sounds that we can hear, the longest wavelengths, and something that we would perceive as actually just a series of like bursts or clicks, or pulses. So, something that's, a 20 hertz sound, sort of like a sound wave that's pushing and pulling 20 times a second. 20 times a second is, we can sort of barely perceive it as a tone. And we can also it's also at the upper limit of like what we could perceive as a rhythm. So, there's a total continuity between them. And I think when we're listening, when we're sort of engaging attentive listening, and by the way, there's lots of theories about different listening states, psychologically. But when we put ourselves into a sort of state of attentive listening, I think we're engaging a part of our brain and our psyche that's like very attentive to time. And rhythmic perception, people say, well, we can, if we study sort of the ability to discriminate moments in time, we're much more able to discriminate between moments if they're in a rhythmic structure. Like we can tell if this beat is 5 milliseconds out of place.
That's interesting.
Whereas if we just heard two events, 10 seconds apart, we wouldn't be able to tell if they were 10 seconds or 10 seconds plus 5 milliseconds. But once you put them into a periodic structure, and it sort of engages all of these faculties for perceiving structure and time that is related to our hearing.
Right.
And
well,
yeah.
You touched on a couple points there that I want to expand on. So one is the idea that when you're enraptured in music, they've actually shown through brain scans that the prefrontal cortex, which generally focuses on introspection, shuts down. So you literally do lose yourself when you are enraptured in music, just as you've said. So I think that's fascinating. The other 2 points I wanted to touch on that you brought up is the idea of rhythm. So, for instance, why do I love some songs whereas I can't stand other songs? Like, I can't stand country music, or at least most country music. I love Johnny Cash, but most country songs I just think is stupid and it doesn't resonate with me personally. Whereas my wife loves country music. She grew up in Tennessee. So, like, why do some rhythmic patterns resonate with me but not with my wife? And I guess to take that concept a little further, why is music such a good predictor of people getting along? I mean, colleges use this to pair roommates in dorms. Like, it seems like the rhythmic preferences are getting at some fundamental truth that is better described by music or better represented by music than any other indicator. Like, why is rhythm so powerful?
Sorry. Hang on one second. Sorry.
It's all right.
Well, it's interesting that you focus on rhythm in that question. I don't know that I would necessarily, though. Certainly, it's a fundamental aspect of music. But maybe more generally, yeah. If you're asking why is music taste such a predictor of compatibility or something, and I think the answer to that is maybe not so much about brains and physiology, but it's really because music is every culture has some kind of music and is usually highly developed as a cultural expression or a ritual or means of communication. Like, you take country music and country music has all of this kinds of signals built in that are based on cultural context. And
so you're making the argument that it's a cultural indicator to a large extent, your music taste. But let's say two people grew up on a desert island, or not a desert island, but let's just say two people grew up without any society, any culture. They're just like Lord of the Flies, but they're on different islands. And then you give these people an array of different musicians, like you give them Johnny Cash and Deadmau5 and Bach and
Brahms or something.
Yeah, whoever. And then let's say you have 100 of these people all growing up alone on their islands, and then you match them by whatever music they like the most. Don't you still think there would be some indicator in people who have the same preference, regardless of culture and society, would end up getting along better if you, let's say, put them on the same island because they both loved Bach more than any of the other options?
Wow, maybe. I wish we could do that experiment. But maybe we don't have to go. Yeah, certainly there's some kind of empirical measures of things that different musics are doing differently, and maybe some of those even correspond to like universal patterns of maybe like probably things like how intense does this music sound to you is probably, or does this sound intense or relaxed is maybe relatively universal, because if I play something that's very slow and soft, it's going to be relaxing, and if I play something that's very loud and fast, it's going to be very exciting.
Right.
Or whatever. you know,
Yeah.
and that's, you know, that those universalities might be in speech as well. You know, it's a big topic.
Well, there's one
Yes.
quote that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Justin.
So
but I
yes,
think,
you go ahead, Ezra. You finish.
well, but I think that even those elements are kind of maybe more relative than we give them credit for. You know, especially when we don't even maybe perceive the same dimensions of expression based on our cultural context. If you grow up speaking a tonal language, like Mandarin, you don't associate inflection and tonality with emotive content because it's part of the semantic content of the language, and emotion is expressed through other means
That's why there's no Chinese Adele.
Right, probably. I mean, and you know, if you in sort of classical Korean or Japanese music has a very different range of tempos that are expressed. Like it's like in Western music and African music, probably the sort of basic sort of reference point for tempo is the heartbeat, and you know we're kind of in this sort of 40 BPM to 180 BPM range, which is kind of, you know,
that's
half
fascinating.
as fast as a heartbeat, or 3 times as fast as a heartbeat, but it's in this sort of range. Whereas in Guangzhou or other like classical Japanese music, the sort of tempo reference point is the breath, and you have pulses that are several seconds apart. That is sort of the main pulse. And
I wonder do you think that the reason that people tend to like slower music more is because the rhythm is more comforting, because it's more similar to the rhythm of your heartbeat or of your breath? Because, for instance, there have been some studies shown that, for instance, more drinks are sold in bars when slow tempo music is being played. Another study found that consumers spend 38% more time in the grocery store when background music is slow. So it does seem to, and then, you know, there was another study that found that apparently the most dangerous song to listen to while driving is Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyrie, because people will just start speeding in their cars and they'll start feeling frantic. And,
wow.
You know, maybe you could have some like really angry hip hop music would be even worse than Wagner. But I do wonder if the reason that people like that sound has such a deep resonance within people, and especially slow sounds, is because maybe it almost makes us feel like we're back in the womb, or it's like we feel our heartbeat, we feel the rhythm of our breath, or maybe of our mother's heartbeat, or something really fundamental.
It's absolutely true that that certain tempos that are close to the sort of median heart rate are more I wouldn't even say relaxing, but more trance-inducing, for sure. So, and even like in electronic music, or you know, in dance music, where BPM is like such a sort of carefully considered element of the music, you know, 120 BPM is trance, is like chill trance, and or deep house or whatever, and it's a very clear preference for, you know, this doom 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 tempo that is, you know, that is you could say it's an octave above the heart rate, the resting heart rate, and it's not and there's some feedback when someone's listening to dance music. If the DJ, you know, gradually modulates the tempo upward, they can speed up everyone's heart rate, actually. And yeah, that's very important, I think. But just to go back to my earlier point, when you take it's very interesting to look at people's reaction to other musical traditions, whether we're talking about harmony intonation or tempo or rhythm, if you really can, if you listen to classical Korean music or classical Japanese music, it almost seems like it doesn't have a tempo or it doesn't have a rhythm, but it's just that the rhythm is this breathing rate is where the pulse is, and then there's all these sort of
I'm just thinking of like when you're getting acupuncture and there's like the heat lamp and the nice peaceful music and
there's like some very slow shamisen music or something playing in the background, and that is but from within that tradition you can perceive a lot of different modulations of it and different expressions of different dramatic or emotional states, and that maybe to someone from a Western tradition they all sound just slow.
Right.
Because the expression is happening in some other axis, like the way that each note is ornamented, or the how big the harmonic intervals are, or the kinds of figures that are played sort of around each beat. I think all of that is very interesting.
I read this
relativism in music.
I read this Medium article that was talking about the same sort of thing, where they said that by modulating the rhythm or the BPM of a song, especially within the same song, you can actually modulate someone's perception of time. So the example this writer used was Schubert's String Quintet in C major. And he shows that within this song, it'll start off with a rhythm that you expect is going to go on, but then the note will just be drawn out for longer than you expect, and then it'll go faster than you expect. And so it's like you're flying through the cosmos while you're listening to this song, because it really is modulating your perception of time and space and everything. And I love this. I love this one quote, which I think gets to the core of a lot of what we've talked about, which is an Aldous Huxley quote. And he said that after science, that which comes nearest to expressing the inexpressible is music. So for whatever reason, it does seem like music has this very cosmic quality to it that can't be expressed better by anything other than science, according to Huxley.
Kind of like the universal truth that you were talking about a little bit ago,
yeah,
that music might be getting to. So what I was going to say earlier is kind of to that point too. One of the fields that kind of gets to universal truths more than a lot of others is like mathematics. I think personally, I just like math. But I saw this video on a channel called 3 Blue 1 Brown, called Music and Measure Theory. And basically he was talking about how when you have two notes together, let's say one is at 500 hertz, one is at 1,000 hertz or something like that, then the fraction between those two is 1/2 or 2/1, depending on where you put it in the fraction. But that is supposedly a beautiful sound to humans because it's a beautiful fraction. Like it's a cleaner fraction than something like 313 over 1,876, something like that.
Right.
So it has this clean mathematical representation, and what he was saying is the reason for this is when you think of sound as waves and these two different notes going together, they overlap more frequently and in a more like beautiful and consistent pattern than like an unclean fraction, for example.
Sure. So what you're describing is,
you go ahead.
Well, what you're describing is the theory of just intonation, which is a very ancient theory going back to Pythagoras, and is definitely, it comes from physics, and it's quite, to at least some extent, that's how our ears work to do frequency discrimination, is to keep track of the beating frequencies between components of a sound, frequency components of a sound. And but kind of what's interesting, and this is one of the things I was referring to when I say that tuning, intonation is culturally defined. Is that so an interesting thing is that, you know, I'm a musician. I went to conservatory and stuff, and I'm trained in the classical tradition, Western European classical tradition. And people ask me a lot if I have perfect pitch, right? Which means, can I listen to, say, a piano key and say whether it's out of tune? And that the idea of perfect pitch is interesting because it's totally arbitrary. Not only the bass reference pitch, but the idea that two intervals are in tune or out of tune. We use a system in Western European music theory. We use a tuning system called equal temperament, which is only a couple hundred years old. It was created under pressures of industrialization, so building instruments in mass, and also to sort of aesthetic pressures to be able to modulate to a bunch of different unrelated keys within the same piece. And equal temperament is funny because it has no natural natural number ratios between keys, actually. The distance between each semitone in 12-tone equal temperament is 12th root of 2, which is an irrational number.
Right.
So,
but isn't it close to, like, it's very close to a rational fraction?
Some of the degrees of the chromatic scale are closer than others.
Okay.
The fifth, in particular, is pretty far. The third is pretty far, and it's very funny because if you play a string instrument, an unfretted string instrument like the violin,
right.
you use beating frequencies to tune to tune yourself. There's no other reference, and so when you tune the distance between two strings, you're tuning them until they are in a perfect fifth, a perfect Justin toned fifth, a 3-to-2 ratio. So you're never actually in tune with the piano, and you're always kind of balancing between these two different tuning system pressures. And actually, the evolution of and the ubiquity of equal temperament coincided with the invention of like heavy vibrato, which is, you know, when you in classical violin performance, yeah, and I think that's because it kind of covers the fact that everyone's on a different tuning system.
Well, I wonder if the music that resonates most with humans is the music that moves at a similar pace of life as the pace of life for humans. And this is it's similar to, so there's this book called Scaling, which is about how you can basically predict the lifespan of any organism just by knowing some fundamental things about it. So for instance, a human is allocated, I forget what the number is, but let's say 1 million heartbeats throughout our life, whereas a mouse is allocated the same number of heartbeats, but they're beating at such a rapid pace that they live for much shorter. So I wonder if mice may prefer music that moves at a faster BPM compared to humans, and maybe whales prefer whales prefer a much even slower music. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever done research on that, but it does seem like people or organisms tend to like the music that moves along at a pace that resonates with them based on their heartbeat, their breath rate, all of those sorts of things.
Have you ever seen an animal react to like a beautiful classical song? Like
Yeah.
My dogs will just like go to sleep, or they'll just calm down immediately right when they start hearing a beautiful song. It's really cool to see.
But like, or parrots, I mean, parrots do this all the time, but now that I think about it, it does seem like they tend to like more uppity music, like the Beach Boys, or like just not quite as slow. But I mean, I don't know. I haven't done any research or seen any research papers on it.
There could be like a multifaceted reason for this too. Like it could have something to do with the the dominance of like whatever frequency your brain waves are working at. Like there's a lot of different things that could, you know, formulate what you were just talking about. It doesn't necessarily have to be pace of life. It could, you know, be the heartbeat, the breath, like Ezra was talking about, or it could be the brainwave patterns, maybe, you know, because when you, I mean, this is something that I talked about. I forgot which episode we talked about this, but they did that. There's that research study with people that listen to white noise when they sleep, and they kind of oscillate the volume of this white noise to kind of the delta brainwave frequency, which is the deep sleep frequency, and the patients or the people in the study actually went into delta deep sleep way quicker and longer than the control, which, you know, didn't have this oscillation, or maybe not even white noise. I'd need to look at the details.
Yeah, a lot of white. There's a lot of colors of noise are interesting that way. Like pink noise is actually pretty effective in relaxation. Pink noise has a frequency response of 1 over where the amplitude is inversely proportional to the frequency, and that's a very common property of natural noise processes, actually. And then another one that is common in nature is brown noise, which is where it's the limit of a random walk.
Yeah, I listen to that every single night.
Oh, really? You go for the brown noise? Yeah.
I go brown noise, and like I have a white noise app, and it says how long I've played, you know, each noise. I think brown noise is at like 380 days of playing this noise. So I've been doing it for a few years, and I feel like I sleep really well. It's almost hard to sleep without it because
that's what I was gonna say.
The other ones.
They said that when you're raising a baby, you have to be really careful about always playing music when it goes to sleep, because then when it grows up and is an adult, it'll like freak out if it doesn't have music around. So I think the conditioning is key. But you did bring up one thing, Ezra, that I want to touch on briefly, which is seeing colors seeing sounds and hearing colors, synesthesia, or also people with ASMR, people who tend to have their wires crossed with their perceptions. So what's going on inside the brain of someone who is able to hear colors or see sounds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know much about it, honestly, and I don't know how much understanding there is neurologically of what's happening there. I find it interesting that there's certain composers in history who've experienced this so strongly that they develop like a whole system of composition around it.
Wow.
Scriabin is a example, famous example. You know, and have like very, very definite. And I've worked with musicians who have this also, have like very strong and definite associations of different keys. It's usually about key, like the fundamental pitch of the song, of the harmonic structure of the song or whatever, and have a very strong association between key and color. But I've never personally experienced it, I don't think.
I haven't either.
And it seems to be definitely something innate, and not just a training thing. So I think there's something going on in the brain doing that, and I'm not aware of any like convincing explanation for it mechanically that's more specific than that.
There's a couple of interesting case studies related to this, not necessarily synesthesia, like seeing colors from sound, but there are people that can like build up their, and organisms, but people that can build up their a view of reality almost like they're seeing when they're blind. So like there's the famous case of the Batman who clicks similar to a bat, and the Batman's just his nickname. and he'll click, and he'll kind of get this picture of reality, like this spatial picture around him, which is something that's hard to do, you know, if you're blind, obviously. But he acts similar to a bat, where he clicks and then he can hear all of the different refractions and reflections of the sound coming off of different objects.
Must be annoying to be that guy's colleague.
Oh yeah, yeah. So humans can definitely develop echolocation to a pretty good degree. There's a really fascinating book that I like. It's a short book called "Touching the Rock" by John Hall, which is about the experience of being blind. And you know, but there's a particular passage where he describes, you know, rain as this magical thing and this blessing because it kind of coats the whole world in sound and makes it perceivable to him.
Well, there's that one scene in the Daredevil movie where he can fully see someone because of the rain.
And my dad actually did quite a bit of work with the School for the Blind in San Francisco in the 60s, and developing devices. One device I just came across in the basement was this. It's like an optical rangefinder, but the output is an oscillator. So it's like a sine wave oscillator that increases in pitch when something is close to the sensor, and the sensor is this beam that you can sweep around. So if you sweep it, and there's like a wall with maybe a couch in front of it, and you sweep the beam across the wall, it'll go like, you know, and then if you sweep it all around, it's this more complicated structure of pitches.
Isn't that kind of like how radar works?
Yeah, I mean it's a very directional kind of echolocation. I mean, and apparently when someone kind of works with this device, they can really become quite effective as a means to perceive the objects around you and the space around you with a surprisingly small amount of training, actually, especially for blind people who are tend to have very excellent pitch memory and kind of have to have a pretty good ability to map sounds to events and to remember their associate them.
I bet it helps to have all the feedback too. Like that always makes learning easier when you have constant feedback of, what is this pitch now? And then you can kind of learn really quickly what each of these pitches means when you just kind of go and test out your environment. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So I want to start moving in the direction of future scenarios. So we've talked a lot about sound as a phenomenon and music and perceptions and all of that. How have things changed up until now, and how might they continue to change in the future? So, for instance, is the world noisier now than it used to be? Are people's levels of hearing worse than they used to be? How much better has sound technology, both emitting sound and perceiving sound, how much better has that gotten, over the last however many years? So Ezra, what's your sense on how sound technology and just noise in general has progressed over the years, and what's it looking like directionarily for the future?
Well, wow, I wish I'd done more homework.
I mean, there's also music as the other phenomenon, like, there's AI composers and all that kind of stuff, but I guess first let's just talk about, you can go ahead.
I think the world is noisier and has been continually getting noisier for a long time. There's actually a whole field called acoustic ecology, or ecoacoustics, which studies kind of a couple of things under this umbrella. One is the sort of effect of the soundscape, the sound environment on people, and then the other way around is like the way people are impacting the different ecologies through sound,
like noise pollution.
Yeah, so noise pollution is sort of the main element to this, and this is a in particular there's something called the World Soundscape Project, which was started in the 60s by Canadians, because who were sort of trying to document the changes in the soundscape and in levels of noise pollution.
Yeah, there's been a couple apps that have come out.
Yeah, I saw a lot of, for example, so I wish I had more numbers at the tip of my fingers, but I don't, but I'm sure the numbers are going up as far as the sort of SPL levels.
And how is sound being used nowadays differently than how it has been used in the past? So, for instance, I remember you were telling me about in San Francisco that they're now weaponizing sound as a way of getting homeless people not to sleep in front of their stores. What are some ways that sound is being used nowadays that, are pretty different from the ways it's been used in the past?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean...
Or like the Cuba incident, for instance, also.
What's that?
I said also, not only San Francisco, but also weaponizing sound, like what we saw with the consulates in Cuba, who had very detrimental health effects as a result of a sonic weapon. So this stuff is all very new.
Yes. Well...
Or it seems new to me. Maybe it's not.
Yeah, the weaponization of sound is definitely has a weird history, especially in the U.S. The U.S. has been sort of a leader, but famously, we used. So there's a number of kinds of acoustic weapons, and in the audible range of sound, you have a whole system a whole area of devices and practices around acoustic deterrence and or acoustic harassment is another word for it. A lot of this is used on wildlife, for example, in aquaculture, fish farms. They put sonic emitters to drive away dolphins, which are predators. There's all this deliberate saturation of introduction of sort of harmful sounds into the aquatic ecosystem that I think is pretty disturbing.
Right.
On the human level, a lot of acoustic weapons have been psychological in nature. Famously in Vietnam and like Apocalypse Now, and where there was a project called Operation Wandering Soul, which was broadcasting the voices of dead Viet Cong soldiers to try to make people think that they were being
ghosts
hunted by them.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, and this kind of thing, and was it the was it Noriega, the sort of sorry, hang on, let me look. Let's edit this out.
Yeah, well, just in the meantime, we should talk about the attack in Cuba. So what happened there is that there were diplomats at the Hotel Nacional, where I've been, only actually like a week and a half before this happened. So it kind of freaked me out when I heard about all this. But basically, we now have the recordings. We can hear what the people in the hotel rooms of the Hotel Nacional heard. And basically, there are these high-pitched frequencies that were almost inaudible, although they could faintly hear them. And it gave them nausea. It gave them permanent hearing loss. It gave them, really terrible headaches and migraines. And that's part of the reason why we pulled out our diplomats, and now it seems to be a very premeditated move on the part of Russia to make sure that the U.S. and Cuba never get too close together, because that's still an instrumental country for Russia's purposes. But it's scary, so I wonder where this could go. Like, that's sort of the first big headline. Where could this go from here?
Yeah, well, so this was, and it was sort of go back, So it was Manuel Noriega who was sort of the U.S. Played heavy metal at the Panama City embassy for a week or something at 110 SPL. So very damaging volumes until he surrendered. That was a very famous application of acoustic violence. Also in places like the Waco, Texas siege, they used tactics like that. And this, so in 2018 there are a couple of these things in the news. One in China, right before the Cuba incident, and there was a lot of speculation about ultrasonic weapons in those cases. One theory that I thought was pretty compelling was that actually it was a form of ultrasonic surveillance, kind of like radar, that kind of had this unexpected side effect. But I mean, all these symptoms that people reported are consistent with the effects of ultrasound, what's called so these are very, very high frequencies of sound, and when they're well above 20,000 hertz, so beyond what's considered the range of possible human hearing. And when you use sounds like that at very high energies, you have an effect called ultrasonic cavitation effect, which is a fancy physics word for forming bubbles in the transmission medium of a compression wave. So,
yikes.
And we actually use ultrasonic cavitation, and it's used in aesthetic medicine to break up fat cells, to basically blow them up, and also tumor cells. And so you can imagine this has a pretty horrible effect on your brain tissue when you get a high energy ultrasonic beam pointed at your head.
Is there anything you could do to protect yourself? Could you wear a metal helmet or something?
You could. There could be not a metal one, because, as you pointed out,
it conducts
is an excellent, excellent medium.
So what would let's say you're in the Hotel Nacional on that night? What would you do to protect yourself?
Probably some sort of diffusive medium, like a
styrofoam or something.
Yeah, styrofoam is kind of weirdly transmissive also, but maybe just like toilet paper or cotton or something.
Okay.
Or like egg crates or something.
Yeah. And I don't know how well diffuser mediums that work in the acoustic range work in the ultrasound range. I'm not sure.
Because it's interesting because, for instance, people use dog whistles all the time to train their dogs. Right. Humans can't hear them, dogs can, but that doesn't cause the same sort of adverse health effects as sonic weapons. So is it really just the energy level of sounds at that frequency that makes it damaging?
I think these ultrasound weapons that can induce cavitation in human tissue are extremely dangerous and scary. There's a whole other class of acoustic weapons or deterrence devices that use infrasound, so sound that's too low to hear, basically pulses, and that can kind of affect your digestive tract and stuff, and make you very uncomfortable and nauseous.
Wow.
And they use these sometimes on shooting ranges, actually, or military training camps. They'll use infrasound to make sure people stay out of the firing range while it's being used, and
Huh.
and it's also, you know, they've been deployed in Iraq also to disperse crowds that they suspect of there being a suicide bomber or in the crowd. They'll use these long-range infrasound pulses to disperse people. But yeah, so what you referred to, Matt, is this story. So like about a year ago, I was in San Francisco on a business trip. So I was staying in a hotel in the financial district, and it was kind of a small old hotel, where, you know, and I had I had the window open and at night, and I could hear this very uncomfortable, very, very high pitched sound. Someone at the range of audibility as far as frequency, but I could tell it was coming from a ways away, and it must have been very loud. And I went out and started just walking around, trying to find out what this thing was, and I found this metal box, like a steel mesh cage box, mounted in a shop doorway, like a
where a hobo would typically sleep.
Doorway where like a homeless person might like to sleep.
Right.
Had this metal cage in it that was emitting a horribly loud sound at a frequency that I could almost not quite hear consciously, but it was, you know, giving me a headache.
God, that's so terrible. Dizzy.
And then I went and you know, I Googled it a little bit, and I couldn't find anything in the local news about this. Although there were reference to other acoustic deterrents for homeless people that different actors in the city have been trying, like playing like loud rock music all night in front of the Billy Graham Auditorium. And people complain and they stop doing that. But I didn't find anything about this ultrasound thing until actually just the other day. I searched for stuff that looks like it, and I found out that it's this device called the Mosquito, that is a commercial device that people. The idea is that it produces sounds that only young people can hear.
Oh yeah.
You know, and that it's sold to like school districts. I mean, it's crazy to try to, wow. And they'll install them to try to discourage loitering.
Wow.
And they're being used a lot in England.
But there's apps in schools that, I mean, on the less detrimental side, there's apps where kids will play this because the teacher can't hear it, and so everyone will be laughing, and the teacher will just be like, "What's so funny?" He can't hear it. But this is much more sinister, where you're actually weaponizing. It's very sound.
Bad. I mean, it's an acoustic poison is kind of how I thought of it, and I looked at the specs for this thing, and it's producing sound at 106 decibels SPL, which is, you know, which causes permanent hearing loss after 1 minute of exposure, actually.
Wow.
So this is a very, very bad thing to be doing, especially to young people. I mean, think about infants and babies that have absolutely no protection against these.
Oh man.
You know, you're just damaging them right out of the gate. And these things have been banned in Germany, which has, and that's a very interesting thing to read the report on the German safety committee that was instrumental in banning these things, because they're like, yes, you know, there's absolutely no scientific doubt that this causes permanent loss, and you know, There's all these effects that are non-conscious. You know, even though you can't hear the frequency, it's still going to be causing, you know, dizziness. Like it's messing with your inner ear.
I mean, we got to get those banned in the U.S. It's crazy that they're not banned. I mean, it's like when you have spikes so that a pigeon can't land on the awning and poop on people. But if just by being in the vicinity of the spikes, you got spiked. That's like basically what's going on.
Right. And there's a very active and vocal movement right now to get them banned in England as well.
Okay, good. That's good.
But yeah, I found that very disturbing.
So given all of this discussion about weapons and maybe even healing mechanisms with
Hmm.
sound, is there any way that we can theoretically, even if it's not currently possible, but any way that we could target specific parts of the body? So instead of having to like isolate the sound spatially on your body, maybe you can still have like a full,
Mm.
like be exposed to sound overall, like your whole body is exposed, but only a certain part of your body is damaged. Because you were kind of saying that
Mm.
the the infrasound can affect your digestion. So does that
Hmm.
mean that it doesn't affect other parts, like certain wavelengths or certain
Um,
frequencies affect certain parts of your body?
Probably. I don't, the higher the frequency of a sound wave, the more directional it can be. It's one thing.
Mm.
So these ultrasound things, which they do use in again in to break up fat in aesthetic medicine, which is kind of
Right.
weird,
Mhm.
but
I've heard they
also
also use it to like they can now dislodge a kidney stone by
yeah,
shooting.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So they use acoustic cavitation on kidney stones and tumors as well in more sort of serious applications, and they're able to do that because an ultrasound beam is highly directional and
Hmm.
can be aimed very precisely, and that's what enables them to build also these weird ultrasound surveillance where they can sort of
Mm.
like read someone's lips with it. It's that precise, but they can
Wow.
also like bounce it around a corner or,
Right. Well,
bounce it into a room and sort of see who's in the room, that kind of thing.
Mm.
I read that
And
this
and
one.
there's yeah, sorry.
I was just saying in the same way. Like I read that this one airline was experimenting with having sound that just goes directly into your ear from the side. So you don't have to put on any headphones. You just sit in your seat and like adjust where it is, and then it just gets beamed into your ear. But no one else can hear it because it's like so precisely directionalized.
Oh yeah, so that could lead into the tech questions, I think, because um, so I was just at the Consumer Electronics Show, this big international consumer tech exposition and trade show in Las Vegas, of all places. Talk about weird acoustic environments, um, questionable uses of sound. But audio is a very big deal right now, in particular, and one of the big audio technologies that's taking off is sound field manipulation. So people are getting better and better at creating directed sound without headphones. So I think we'll be seeing. I saw a lot of these sort of round the neck devices. They're like personal sound field emitters that
Mm.
where instead of wearing headphones, you wear this sort of a loop around your neck that has these emitters that supposedly only you can hear, although
Hmm.
I found it to be a little iffy. Um, but and that so you have this like personal um, this you can have this personal sound um, and also have your ears open to the world, which is much more
Hmm.
comfortable.
Mm.
And there is one thing I did see that was quite amazing. Sony, by the way, is doing a lot of this sound field stuff, and they had a quite amazing system for inducing surround sound, pretty directed 360-degree directional sound from a single speaker in the room,
Oh wow, that's
or
awesome.
array of speakers. That was really quite impressive. So that is one area where we've had a lot of advances. Well, we've really in the last like 20 years, people have been getting pretty good at this stuff in a research context. But it's now making it to the consumer electronics world.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. So at this point, we've touched on a lot of good sound applications, like what you just discussed. with dislodging tumors and creating surround sound. We've also talked about some really damaging applications like sonic weapons. I think we should take a quick break now, and then let's get into the worst case, best case, and most likely future scenarios. All right, let's get into the worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario.
So Ezra, in your mind, what is the worst case scenario for the future of sound?
Well, I think I saw a glimpse of it in Las Vegas, where there's like every where no thought and no respect is given to the acoustic health of the environment or of the people in it, and sound is being deployed as a behavior manipulation mechanism, whether it's through pop music that's supposed to make you put you in a different state of mind or entice you in this like very basic way, or this sort of pings and the sounds of like slot machines, or in our more universal sort of digital life, the sounds of acoustic UI cues telling you you've got a text, you've got an email, giving this, tapping into that low level auditory mechanism that responds with hormonal changes to sounds. I think music is taking a lot of weird directions right now with the way people experience music, as a kind of a functional thing, like a stream of stimulus that is supposed to sort of modulate your state of mind. You put on Spotify, you put on a playlist that tells you to feel this certain way. You
put on the deep focus Spotify playlist that's specific for you and is background, and you have no relation to the artist. It's just about getting you in a certain type of rhythm or mindset.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, and it's kind of fine in a lot of ways, but it disregards a lot of uses of music that are crucial to me as a musician. I think there's the reason everyone develops musical traditions is that is not to put you in the right state of mind or something, but because it's a ritual, it's a mode of communication, of community building, and the act of listening is just as important as the act of creating sound to have for music to function.
I've heard this quote that says that the sound of rain or raindrops needs no explanation. So just like raindrops, any great piece of music, it's not going to be like, oh, this is your focus music or this is your party music, or it needs no explanation. You can't express, like, that's why all the great classical compositions, they're not, it's just, that's why they don't typically have a name for them. Like, it's typically just concerto in C minor or C major, because how can you express that which is inexpressible?
Yeah. So I kind of fear for the future of music in that way, in that it sort of becomes, we don't have instead of having music, we have muzak, and that's like there to soothe people or excite them for a specific function. And on the sort of broader, like, acoustic level, I'm afraid that the world is getting noisier and noisier, and especially with the advent of voice interface, where it's just every device is going to start talking to you and chattering at you.
Right. I wonder if it would be possible one day to have some sort of built-in noise blocking. I don't know if it would be hardware or what, but it does seem really useful, like how you said at the beginning of this episode, how we can close our eyes, but we can't close our ears. it would be cool if at some way in the future you did have some way of just totally deciding what sounds come into your field and what sounds don't.
Yeah, I mean, earmuffs work fine, but you know, to some degree, earplugs work fine. But another big element of development at CES area is active noise cancellation, of course, which basically means that you have headphones with a little microphone next to the speaker, and whatever's coming into the microphone is like inverted and played back, so it cancels out.
Right. By the way, I've always wondered about how noise cancellation actually works, and I get that it's the inverse of the wave, so it cancels it out. But the thing I've always wondered is, can that still damage your hearing? Because even if you can't perceive it, aren't you still taking in this force of sound? And like, let's say you live 20 years with lots of noise, but it's always being canceled by an inverted wave, versus 20 years with just no noise at all. Wouldn't the former person have worse hearing after that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would like to see more research on this, but I think that what ANC does is it certainly makes things perceptually quieter and less distracting, but it's like camouflage, and it's definitely not perfect. And when I use it, which I don't use it habitually, but when I go and try it, you know, it's like, okay, sure, I can't hear that sound anymore, but I can hear this background of like static.
Right. It's like putting a seashell to your ear or something. It has that like whooshy kind of, like, you know something's there, but you can't really hear it.
And I know that my auditory system is being engaged by this, and it's not, and I don't find it a relaxing experience. I find it kind of an unnerving, uncanny experience that, and I think it's like, and my brain and limbic system is still in like a state of like heightened attention that it would be in if I was like in traffic or something, you know. It's like still trying to react to these stimuli, but it can't. But the stimuli have been attenuated so that to the degree that I can't tell what they are anymore. So for me, and I wear hearing protection a lot, I just wear earplugs, you know. The more high quality, the better. But to speak to like the scary future is, I think I can definitely see this future, and it kind of exists already in the cities, in American cities, where, you know, there's music being piped at you from everywhere, but it's not really music. It's not like you're not having a musical experience. And there's noise everywhere. There's beeps and boops and alarms everywhere. And a few people, the people who can afford to develop and acquire the technology, are wearing ANC headphones, really good ANC headphones, everywhere they go. And everyone else is just going deaf.
Right,
basically.
right.
And,
you know.
Yeah. Okay, Justin, what's your worst case future scenario?
So I would echo a lot of what Ezra said. My focus was most on the environment and like the natural environment. So for all of the organisms, I mean, humans are also a byproduct of this. They're part of the organisms being damaged, but I hate when I see these big loud roads being constructed, and it's obviously just the noise of the cars are damaging, and no one cares really about the noise of cars. It's just one extra thing that's adding noise to the environment, and it's just kind of unnerving to see this. I recently listened to a TED talk about how the diversity of noise in ecosystems is decreasing, which is really interesting to me. And Ezra, you might have a couple of things to say about this. Is like, I understand rainforests to be extremely noisy places. So all of the different organisms in there are making their own noises, whether it's for mating or something else. but I just see this increase in artificial noise that's damaging the ecosystems all over the world. Because I mean, there's a lot of variation in the natural ecosystem, but everything, all the organisms are adapted to handle it. Whereas this new noise that humans are creating, the organisms are not adapted to handle the noise. So like bats are really struggling. Anything that has some sort of dependence on sound, they're struggling. I think frogs use sound to find their mates at night. Like when you hear crickets, like they're also using sound to find mates at night. So I just think there's these things that people don't think about, like sound, that affect and damage the environment. And I think it's going to be one of the last things that gets figured out, because a lot of people just kind of forget about it. They think about the more explicit pollution like CO2 levels or plastics or something like that. So, you know, it's just, I'm just really worried about the noise pollution. And I think in the worst case scenario, we don't really care until it's too late, and that all the ecosystems are fully damaged. And, you know, and then a lot of what Ezra was saying as well, with people being damaged by all the sounds and you know, all the weapons that are being used, especially in the aquatic environments. So yeah, that's basically.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree, and the effect of sound on the ecology is one of these things where I feel like we're destroying something before we even understand what it is. Like, and especially in aquatic environments, not just with this deterrent stuff, but for example, with seismic blasting being a big as part of offshore mining and drilling, that of course our current U.S. administration is pushing the gas on. You know, that is extremely damaging to ocean life.
Yeah, well, you guys encapsulated the worst case pretty well. So the only thing I'll add to it is the word that really struck out to me, or that struck me, that Ezra, you were talking about, is behavioral manipulation. Because especially as a marketer, I can see that getting more and more prominent as we get more data around what sounds cause people to act in certain ways. And there's going to be more unintended sound regardless anyways. I mean, we talked about in the future of cities that we're going to have 10 billion people very soon. We're growing at a rate of, we basically need a new 1 million person city like every week. I mean, we're just growing so rapidly. So if you think about all the construction, all of the flights, all of the driving, everything else that goes along with human life, our unintended sounds are going to increase. And then if on top of that we have intended sounds increasing, whether it's through sonic weapons or through behavioral manipulation, almost like virtue signaling, but through sounds to get certain types of people in your store and indicate certain things, I could see the worst case just being, like you said, Ezra, a very noisy world where most people are exposed to so much sound that they go deaf before they're even, fully, before they're even in their 30s or 40s, maybe. We're already seeing people losing their hearing younger and younger. So now I'd like to turn it and talk about the best case scenario. So Ezra, in your mind, what's the best case future look like for the future of sound?
Best case scenario.
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of positive things also. Throughout the history of this industrialized sound phenomenon and the increased noisiness of the world, there's been a lot of people who are aware of that and working on trying to enact public health policy around noise pollution. And now, so another thing that I thought was interesting at the CES show was that there were a lot of a lot of people working on hearing protection and assistance, very high tech attenuating earplugs that are not expensive, but well designed to limit damaging exposure without compromising your sort of ability to understand people or listen to music. Very, very interesting advances in sort of bionic perception, like DSP techniques to filter out sounds that are far away without filtering out while keeping sounds that are nearby. And I hope that there will be to see more application of material science to acoustic insulation in places like freeways. There's no reason we couldn't turn our attention to making noisy technologies quieter engines, you know.
Right. With electric cars, we've already seen a huge decrease.
Yeah, absolutely.
Noise.
So I hope that, we'll have more and more technologies that don't rely on combustion, which is an explosive, noisy process, that don't rely on as many moving parts, as more and more stuff goes into silicon or new technologies for moving energy around. And then I think another sort of interesting aspect of the increased reliance on voice control, voice communication was another huge topic at CES. Everyone is integrating voice controls into every conceivable device, and that's going to be a pretty weird experience and maybe not that useful in a lot of cases, but I think it's going to awaken a lot of people to the sort of reality of what is good and bad about being constantly exposed to the voice communications. I was talking to our coworker Justin Lai, who's a health policy expert, and he was turning me on to some of this very interesting work being done in hospitals where there's all these different devices that are always beeping at you, or alarms and stuff. And there's a real problem with, for example, alarm fatigue, where, doctors and nurses are hearing alarms all day and can't really, don't react to them well enough. And also, of course, for the patients, it's psychologically very wearing to be around this stuff where I imagine, or I was imagining, like the last thing you hear in life is going to be some beeping alarm, and then, so there's a couple of interesting projects about trying to redesign that environment and make and it shades into sound UI in general. There's some projects to make acoustic UI feedback more organic, less fatiguing, more naturalistic, and I think we could, the more we turn towards sound as a means to interact with our devices and our world, the more care I hope we'll invest in making sure it's healthy on every level, the physiological level and the psychological level.
Yeah, I mean, one trend we talk about a lot, and hence the future, is how as technology gets better and better, it disappears. Whereas like maybe the 80s was like peak visual technology, like big boombox on the shoulder, like all about the heart, which was kind of an awesome like glory days in its own right. But I think as we look into the rest of the 21st and the 22nd century, it's going to be more invisible technology that allows us to live more naturally as how we evolved to live, but with, obviously a lot of advantages in how we can survive and connect and communicate and all those other things. So I think in the same way, as sound technology gets better and better, it will disappear in the sense as it'll be less and less noisy. And hopefully we can create smarter ways to control sounds without having to emit too many sounds. And I mean, I think of like in Her, where everyone's like walking around talking quietly to their own OS, like doing incredibly complex functions. And And yeah, that's a little clunkier than a brain machine interface where it just goes directly, but that's a pretty good world if you can just talk quietly and get basically anything you need to done. So that's my best case scenario for the future of sound. I'm interested to hear about yours, Justin.
Yeah, so I mean, mine would basically be the converse of my worst case scenario. So, Ezra talked a lot about how we're making things better. You know, there's a lot of advances with making things quieter. I do think one of the things that would be really awesome is to get any sort of, well, okay, I'll back up a little bit. So, like I said, the transportation system right now is still really loud, with all the combustion engines, but I even think the just the rubber hitting the pavement with hundreds of thousands of cars on a highway, like that's still a decent amount of noise for the ecosystems around. But what bothers me even more is the talk about having drones do delivery. So if we have all these drones flying around over forests and disrupting even forest animals, not even animals that live near roadways, like that could be a huge issue. But what would be awesome is if the something like the Boring Company works, where we can move most of our transportation underground and away from all of the environment.
And the earth could just absorb those sounds.
Yeah, basically. So, I mean, there's nothing really down there, at least as far as I'm aware, to damage with the sound, unless for whatever reason the sound damages the infrastructure of the tunnels. Obviously, that would be a huge issue. I don't think it will be. You know, I'm sure the engineers are thinking about all of that. But yeah, that would be kind of the best case, is having all of these things, all the sound, disappear, kind of like you were saying. And
yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it just struck me that I think another best case scenario for sound would be if we can harness the power of sound. Like, imagine if you were the god of sound, or like a superhero whose superpower is that you can manipulate sound in any way possible. I mean, the potentiality for that is pretty incredible. I mean, if you talk about like having cancerous cells in the body, I mean, if we already are able to dislodge tumors, if you're able to use sounds to specifically affect that which you cannot easily get to in a physical sense, but because you can bump atoms into each other, you can create you can create a domino effect that can allow us to do things that we are not able to do today. So that would be one additional aspect I would add.
One thing, you know, to kind of touch on that point that I've heard, and Ezra, you might call bullshit on this. This is just something that I've heard works. So, you know, in some cases. But have you heard of like binaural beats, that have one frequency going in one ear, another frequency in another, and then your brain has to work to kind of connect the two. So it helps with brain hemisphere communication. And then it like affects like the actual brain structure. So you can maybe get to your brain directly just through sound and affect the brain structure, which might be really interesting when you talk about like cognitive psychology and learning. You know, if we can figure out how to harness some of these interesting technologies, that would be a really cool scenario, kind of like you were saying.
Or maybe in like the super far future, we'll somehow find a way to break the sound barrier, and we'll be able to basically have radio chats with aliens. Or with our past selves.
Radio isn't sound. Well, that would be.
But I just mean like walkie-talkie, like, how's it going there in the past? Pretty good, but we have to solve this one problem. All right, sending you the info.
Oh my gosh.
I get it.
Okay, so let's bring this home and get into the most likely future scenario.
Most likely scenario.
So, Ezra, what do you think is the most likely future scenario for the next 50 to 100 years as it's related to sound?
Well, I have to kind of, um, I have to guess that it's going to be more like the worst case than the best case. And given the way we've been going so far, and our disinclination to change directions, I think we're going to be looking at a noisier world, um, and a place where some people have the means and access to technologies to make their lives calmer and better and happier from an acoustic health standpoint. And meanwhile, we're going to be increasing the damage we do to acoustic ecologies before we've even studied them. On the bright side, I think that our sort of I think that for music, one of the most amazing things that's ever happened to human activity, human musical activity, is the availability of technology to produce sounds, any sound you can imagine, and we basically have that now, and it's going to be getting better. I think the next step with music technology will be working on user interface to make more powerful and expressive forms of sound production, and it's almost magical that I can, listen to anyone's music in the world right now that they made that they made all by themselves and distributed all by themselves, and that's an exciting future to be in, as long as we can sort of pull back our more excessive or atavistic impulses and remember that sound and music is a spiritual practice as well as communication or coercion.
Right.
And remember that listening is as important as sound making when it comes to connecting with the world and with each other.
I like it. Now, one thing I didn't think about in the best case scenario, though, is just to add a couple things to the best case, is I think it would be awesome to fully understand the communication of like orcas and dolphins and all these other organisms and kind of figure out how they communicate. And I want that to be part of our future, is trying to communicate with non-human organisms in a more like complete way.
So just how you already have that thing where you can go to China and say, hey, like, hello, how are you? And it'll translate it. You could say something to a dolphin and it would go like,
So I know that probably the fundamental structure of how they communicate is so different from us, but if we could somehow make that translation, I think that would just bridge so many gaps. It would make them less like the other. And I think more people would care if we could actually hear the thoughts of other organisms and kind of translate them into a human compatible form.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I do see that a lot of these really far out technologies will probably come into fruition. I just think in the likely case, where like a lot of other episodes, we talk about how we're going to go through something bad before we get to a better scenario. So we might approach the worst case scenario first, and then people will be like, oh wow, that was terrible, we shouldn't have done this, we should have thought more about acoustic ecology, and then we can move on to the best case scenario. So I think that's probably what
I think that's accurate. I mean, when I think of future scenarios, I think about up until the AI revolution and then after the AI revolution. Or another way you could look at it is up until the time where humans still have jobs and do work, and then after the time where humans can, actually contribute to the economy in some meaningful way. And so up until we get to that point where people still have jobs, whatever, I think what Ezra said is accurate in that you're going to have to pay not to hear annoying sounds. Just like how you're going to have to pay not to see annoying ad images. And I think that there is going to be a bit of a stratified world where to have your comforting environment where you only have the sounds and the visions and the stuff that you want, you're going to have to pay a premium for that. If you want the free version of the world, well, there's going to be ads. You're going to have to hear some shit you don't want to hear. You're going to have to see some shit you don't want to see. And I think once we get to the point where humans no longer contribute to the economy, it's basically the whole economy is automated, and we just have to worry about what's the best for our own quality of life. I think once we get to that point, whether it's 2050 or 2100 or whatever, then I think we're going to get very close to the best case scenario, because people are going to realize that what matters most is the quality of our lives. And by thinking about the acoustic ecology and thinking about meaningful sounds and making meaningful connections with the musicians and everything that music and sound represent, I think we are going to have a bright future when you look far enough on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any final thoughts? Any advice for people of how to protect their hearing, or any cool sound products or anything else, Ezra, on your end?
Not really. I'd say, just consider earplugs. Passive ear protection is very important in the world we have right now, the urban world, and it's worth investing $20 in a pair of earplugs that fits well and has a nice flat attenuation, and it's comfortable to wear while you're walking around.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening. This has been the Future of Sound. Thanks to Ezra for coming on the pod. And we hope to hear you, or we hope to see you guys next time for the Future of Border Security.
What has happened, what is currently happening,
Yeah, thanks, guys.
and
That
what
was
will
fun.
inevitably happen.
Yeah.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
Let's have this stimulated consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind the strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
It's possible. Future.